Welcome to the Medium in the Middle podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie, the medium in the middle. This podcast is going to walk you through my journey into mediumship and how I came to realize that I could communicate with souls that have passed over. My adventure started just over a year ago when unusual situations started happening to me. It wasn't until I really started to pay attention to them that it all started to come together. I wrote down everything that I was experiencing this past year in a little black book, and this podcast is going to be a recap of all of those memories leading up to where I am today in my mediumship journey. I will be releasing new episodes every Tuesday, and I recommend listening to the podcast in order, starting with episode 1, as my story will unfold more week by week. If you would like to stay connected with me, follow me on Instagram at mediuminthemiddle. Welcome to episode 4. I am so excited to share this episode with you. To this day, this story goes down as one of the biggest experiences that I've had to date. So far we've had the story with Joe's grandpa's cousin, then the Maria story, and then we had the cottage experience. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please go back to episode 1 and listen to 1, 2, and 3 so that you are aware of where I am in my journey at this time. But before we jump into episode 4, I want to start to give a timeline so everyone can follow along where we are up until today. It is currently August 2019, and this story is going to be happening at the end of September 2018. And to give you an idea, I took my crystal healing course at the end of July or the beginning of August 2018. So I'm exactly 1 year from when these stories started happening to me. So in the last episode, we talked about the cottage story, and I discussed how I drove up to the cottage with my friend. We're going to call this friend Tara. So Tara was obviously at the cottage the whole weekend, so she experienced everything that everyone else experienced, and she went home and told her mom. So shortly after we get home from the cottage, I get a message from Tara saying that her mom wanted to book in with a Reiki session with me because she really wanted to talk to her dad who had passed away. And I immediately got super nervous and super tense, and I called her and I said, Tara, this hasn't been any kind of consistent. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want your mom to come with this expectation and then I can't deliver on it. She said, okay, I'll tell my mom, but I think she still wants to have an appointment with you. So about a week later, I'm heading over to Tara's house because we were planning an event together and we were doing the final touches. So it was the night before the event. So it was Tara and I and her other friend, Emily, were all there doing the final touches for the event. We had a laundry list of things to do, and I wasn't able to get to Tara's house until about 8 p.m., so we kind of had to put our heads down and get to business. So while we were at Tara's house, Tara's mom was there, and she was helping us. So, for example, when we needed something printed, she would run and print it. When we needed a piece of paper, she would go and find us a piece of paper. When we needed a picture frame, she would go and find a picture frame. And it was about 2 hours of this constant work. We were going through the checklist. We were getting everything ready for the event the next day. And after a few hours, Tara's mom was like, all right, girls, I think you guys have everything under control. I'm going to go down to my office now and do some work, and let me know if you need anything else. We were like, great, thanks. And she said before she left, she's like, oh, and Steph, I do still really want to book an appointment with you before you leave, because at this time I was moving across the country in about a month. And she said, I really want to try to talk to my dad. And I again reiterated what I had said to Tara. I said, I can definitely get you an appointment before I go, but I just don't want you to have any expectations about, talking to your dad. I have no idea how to control this. It's only happened a few times. I don't really want you to think that you can and then nothing happen. And she was like, you know what? I would just love to try. And if we could just have an appointment before you go, I'd really appreciate it. And I said, awesome. I was like, we need to stop talking about this now, because in my experience, the more we talk about it, it would kind of start to happen. So I said, I'll definitely get you in and we'll talk next week. She said, okay. And she went down to her office. So Tara, Emily, and I get back to work, and I realized it had been a few hours, and I was like, whoa, I really have to go to the washroom. So I left the kitchen where we were working and I went to the foyer, and there's a powder room right off the foyer. And when I turned on the light in the powder room, She had one of those Glade scent things that go psh every 15 minutes or whatever it is. So when I turned on the light, the Glade smelly thing went off, but it scared the crap out of me. So when I turned on the light, it went psh, and I fell back into the door, and I was like, and I was like, oh, like, Steph, like, you're pretty jumpy today. Like, why did that scare you so much? So then I'm in the washroom and I'm thinking, okay, I'm starting to get the hang of it that when I get scared or something different or out of the ordinary happens, it's a spirit trying to communicate with me. So I'm thinking, okay, like, if you are someone, tell me some details. So as I'm sitting there, this person that scared me tells me that they're 36 or 37, they're male, they have light brown hair, and it's thinning, and it's like thinner at the top of the head, and they worked on a farm or they lived on a farm, but they're somewhere where there's like a lot of grass. Like, I see a lot of grass. So I was like, okay. So as I'm washing my hands, I'm finishing on getting this information. So I walk out of the washroom back into the kitchen where Tara and Emily are. And I asked Tara, I said, hey, who's the man in your washroom that's about 36, 37 years old, thinning, light brown hair? It's kind of longer on the sides, thinner on the top, and would have been working on a farm or living on a farm or something about having a lot of grass around him. And her face kind of goes blank and she says, that's my grandpa. And I was like, oh, like, this is a young man though, like, he's 37 oldest. And she said, yeah, my grandpa died when my mom was 7 years old. I never knew him, but that's exactly what he looks like. Do you want to see a picture of him? And I said, yeah, like, I'd love to see a picture, like, to see if this is the man. So she goes and she grabs a picture of him. I'm like, yeah, that's what he looks like. That's what he looks like. And she said, oh my God. And I was like, you have to call your mom, I guess, like, it's happening now. So she goes and calls her mom and to come back to the kitchen. And at this point, the energy is getting pretty heated. She's like, oh my gosh, that's my grandpa. I need to call my mom. So it was, Mom, come to the kitchen. Her mom came to the kitchen. She's like, what? I'm like, I think your dad is here. This is what he told me. She's like, oh my God, yes. She's like, what do we do? And I was like, I don't know. I've only ever done this through a Reiki session. So we all decided to just sit at the kitchen table and I close my eyes. And as I close my eyes, I start to cry. And I was like, okay, so I know this is kind of the way that it goes. I have been crying whenever a soul is trying to come through. So there's tears coming down my eyes. And the first thing that I say is, these aren't my tears, these are your dad's tears. And I distinctly remember this being the first time that I recognized that it wasn't my feelings that I was feeling. It was the first time that I was like, oh, I'm not crying, but it's just her dad crying. So my eyes were closed and I was looking down and to the left. And I said, okay, I don't have anything right now, but I see a lot of grass and I see you and like your two brothers. And you're like sitting in this big grassy area. And she was like, okay, like maybe we used to sit in grass. I don't know. And I was like, okay, like let's just kind of wait. In my mind, it's almost like a movie scene playing. So I just have to wait for the next scene. So then it was, to describe it the best I could, it was like the camera started to turn. And I started to describe what I saw. I'm like, okay, so I'm sitting in the grass with my two brothers, and now I'm turning around and there's a house. And the house has a window on the right-hand side, and it's a tall, little, small, white house. I started to describe what the house looks like. And she says, okay, yes, like that's the house that we moved to, but it was the house that we moved to right after my dad died. And I said, okay. And then I say, okay, I'm walking up to the house and the window, there's like this little sitting room. And as I look into the window, I see my wife crying. And then I'm like, oh, I'm your dad. And I'm looking into the window and I see my wife crying and I'm crying. And I say, I'm crying because I left my wife and my 3 kids and I never wanted to leave them, and I never wanted that life for her. Now she's going to have to raise these kids without a dad, and I just passed away, and you kids are young, and I'm not going to get to experience your life. So for a while it was the father looking through the window at the mother who was weeping in the chair. And Tara's mom confirmed. She said, yeah, my mom used to sit in that front room and just look out the window and cry. She said it was heartbreaking to watch my mom. So I said, okay. And I said, okay, now I'm leaving the window. And I say, I see someone, I think it's one of my sons, like walking across a stage and graduating. So I don't know what that means, but I see just one son walking across a stage and graduating. And it seems like a very big deal that he's doing this. And then Tara's mom explains to me, yes, she's like, when we were younger, my mom could only afford to send one of us to school. So she sat all three of us down and said, listen, kids, I can only afford to send one of you to school. Like, who's it going to be? And she said, we all decided it would be my older brother. And she said, Mom, like, I'll find a way to make money. Don't worry about it. So she's like, the fact that my dad was at my brother's graduation is actually a huge deal because he was the only one of us that was able to go to college at that time. I said, okay. And then I started to describe her two brothers. And I said, your oldest brother has a boy and a girl, and your younger brother has, and I started to tell her what kids they had. At this point, I don't remember the details, but I remember telling her how many kids each of her brother had. And she said, yes, that's how many kids he has. Yes, that they're a boy and a girl, or they're a boy and a boy. And I said, and your oldest brother named his oldest son after your dad. And your dad wants to thank you for that. Like, he feels so honored that your brother would name his first son after her dad. And she starts crying. And now, even though my eyes are still closed, I can feel that the three people around me are all crying. I have Tara, Emily, and Tara's mom all at the kitchen table. And she says, yes, he did, like, name his son after my dad. And I said, okay. And now he's showing me, like, there's you and your brother, and you're not getting along with the other brother about something. And I think it has to do with how you're caring for your mom. And your dad wants you to remember what your mom did for you and what she gave up and how hard it was to raise 3 kids when I died when you folks were small. And he said, you need to now remember that when she's old and she needs you most. And he said to Tara's mom, he said, yeah, that one brother that's not picking up the slack, you need to tell him to get his shit together because this is your mother and you need to care for her the best you can. And she kind of nodded and she was like, yeah, me and my siblings, we're not all agreeing on what we should be doing with mom's health now that she's getting older. And I said, well, I think this one brother needs to hear that he needs to, get on board with this because your dad's kind of being like, remember what happened when you were younger and what she had to do for you. And now it's your turn to do for her. And she was kind of like, yes, I hope he listens. So it seems like I'm talking with details from her dad. It's kind of going through everyone's life. Her dad talks about how he knows about her 3 kids. He knows about things going on in their lives. He kind of said a little bit about each kid. He knows the youngest daughter was in school. He knew the oldest son had a child. He knew the middle son was giving her a little problems, but everything was going to be okay. And he touched on almost every stage of her life since he had passed away. And in the middle of this reading, I felt someone else come to the room, but my eyes were closed and I had 3 people crying at the dinner table with me. So I just kept continuing to say everything he was saying. And then all of a sudden the burping started. And I opened my eyes and the tears started to slow down. And I said, oh, when I start to burp, that means that it's ending. And she said, what do you mean? I was like, well, your dad's gone. Like, when I start to burp, it just means he's gone. And she's like, just like that, it's over? Like, and by this time, I think it had at least been 40 minutes of talking and crying, and the messages didn't come through, obviously, that quickly, but the gist of it was all the details I just shared. And I opened my eyes, and this was the first time that I kind of had an audience, and I had 4 people staring at me. So the 4th person that walked into the room was Tara's mom's husband. He kind of didn't know what was going on, but he was sitting silently, and the other 3 ladies were crying, and they were like, wow, that was incredible. Where did that come from? Are you okay? What do you need? Do you need water? Do you need food? How can we help? And I was kind of in shock because this was the first time someone had came and talked for that long. Like, he had so many messages. He covered almost her whole life from when she was 7 till now. He talked about her brothers, he talked about his mom, all the kids, like, it was just incredible. And I had tears in my eyes, my cheeks were wet, and I was shaking, and they're like, why are you shaking? Why are you shaking? And I was like, I don't know, normally when I burp, any symptom that I was feeling always goes away. So when the burping happens, if I was crying, I stopped crying. If I was shaking, I stopped shaking. If I felt pain in my chest, the pain in my chest goes away. It was almost like an on and off switch. The burp meant it's off, it's over. And I had these people and they were like, what can we do? What do you need? Do you need water? And I was like, I don't know. That was the longest anyone has ever talked. Maybe I just need a break. Maybe I just need to walk away from you guys. So I walked away from the room. I went to the washroom again. I came back and I was still trembling. Like my whole body was shaking. They're like, why are you shaking? I'm like, maybe I need some water. I drink some water. I'm still shaking. And I'm like, maybe I need something to eat. By now it's 10 o'clock and I hadn't eaten. So I try to eat an apple. And as I'm lifting the apple to my mouth, my hand is shaking and I can't even take a bite. And I didn't know this till afterwards, but I guess I was trembling my words as well. So I guess when I was talking, I was like, I don't know why I'm shaking. Like my voice was shaking as well. And at this point, Tara's mom's husband, we'll call him Frank. So Frank kind of starts to ask more questions. He was looking at me like, okay, but why are you shaking? And I was like, I don't know. He's like, could this be someone else? And I said, I don't know. I've never done this in front of more than one person. I've never done this outside of a Reiki session. I've never had an audience. I was like, as far as I know, when I burp, the symptoms go away and it means it's over. And I burped and I'm still shaking. And then he said, could this be someone else? And I started to say, I don't know. Like, what is shaking? Does anyone know someone that died from shaking? So I look at Tara, I look at Emily, I look at Emily's mom. Anybody know anybody that died from shaking? Like, could this be someone else? And everyone's like, what is shaking? What is shaking? I don't know. Like, what are you feeling? What is shaking? And I was like, I don't know. I'm not a doctor, but like my whole body, I cannot even recreate what was happening to this day. When I tell this story, I kind of tremble my hand, but my entire body was trembling almost uncontrollably. And I was like, I don't know what shaking is. I'm not a doctor, but who knows someone that died of shaking? And it was Frank who was kind of like just saying the slightest things that I just started to have this feeling that it was someone for him. And I said, this soul is for you. And he said, I don't know anyone that died of shaking. What is shaking? What is shaking? I was like, I don't know, but this person is for you. And I said, you just think for a moment, who died of shaking? What is shaking? Like, let's think. We can figure this out. Frank's face goes blank. The whole room goes silent. And he said, my brother died of Parkinson's. And he was shaking just like you were shaking. And his voice was trembling just like your voice was trembling. And I said, it's your brother. It's your brother. So we sit back down at the dinner table and we get this going all again. So again, I sit down at the dinner table now because I had stood up to try to have something to drink and eat. And I'm not crying, but my eyes are closed. And I feel like I can't open my eyes. So I kind of say, okay, well, I'm just going to do the same thing I just did and kind of sit here and wait for information and I'll tell you whatever I get. And he said, okay. I say, okay. So I'm sitting and I feel like there's half of my life. There's half of my life where it's bright and airy and happy and everything is good. And then I say something happened. And then the second half of my life is dark and different and something dramatically changed in the middle of my life where after that moment, nothing was the same. So I go on to talk about his brother's life. And when I'm talking about the half before, I can open my eyes and I can look at them and I'm talking and I'm saying, okay, like I know I have 2 sons. I know I have a wife. I know that I have like a job. Everything is fine. Everything seems good. And then when I'm talking about the second half of my life, my eyes close and I can't open my eyes and I'm describing this. But I asked Frank not to give me any details. I say, can you just say yes or no if things make sense? But don't tell me the story until after because I just don't want to be fed any kind of information. I just want to tell you what I know. And then at the end, you can tell me if it all makes sense. So he said, okay, so you just want me to say yes or no? I say, yeah, please just say yes or no if things make sense. And if they don't make sense, I'll either try to describe it in a different way or just figure out what it means. So I'm telling him about these 2 halves of my life. And I'm saying that the second half of my life, it's like I can't open my eyes. It just feels dark. Everything took a turn for the worst. I don't know what happened in this half of my life, but I just felt like I couldn't open my eyes. And I say, I know my son right now is one of my sons, my younger son, is going through a hard time right now. And you're worried that he's going down the same path that I did during the second half of my life. And he said, don't worry, he's going to learn from my mistakes, but it's going to take him a little bit longer. And he talked about how his older son had a child. And he also talked about his brother's kids. So he was talking about Frank's kids. And then I say, now he's taking me to the end of his life, and he's sitting in a chair facing the corner. I either feel like I'm silent, or I feel like I'm alone, or I'm in a chair and I'm facing the corner and I'm silent. And he said, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then I said, now he's bringing me to my time of death, and I'm in my bed and I'm sleeping, and I kind of pass away. And he said, okay, yeah. And I say, there's just like, it's almost like I went to bed and then I never woke up. That's how it feels like I passed away. And then he said, okay. And then again, the burps start happening. He didn't talk as long as Tara's mom talked, but he definitely talked for about 20 minutes. And right before Frank's brother's soul left, the last thing he said was, very quickly, I'm with Dad, bye. And it was so sudden, I was like, oh, the last thing he said was, he kind of like shouted it, I'm with Dad, bye, and then bam, he was gone. His soul left. I opened my eyes again. It was almost like my eyes were glued closed, and then I opened my eyes, and I opened my eyes to a table full of people with tears in their eyes. And I was like, okay, did that make sense? Like, what, did any of that make sense to you? What happened? Can you explain this all to me now? What happened in the middle of my life? What happened that before everything was light and bright, and then after everything was dark? And he said, in the middle of my brother's life, he went blind. And I was like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. That's why I literally physically couldn't open my eyes. And he said in the second half of his life is when he got the Parkinson's disease. And he did isolate himself because he kind of made himself like the victim, and he by the end of his life, he was very much alone. So he's like, I don't know if him being in a chair in the corner was figuratively speaking, or if he physically was alone in a corner. But he said by the end of his life, he had kind of isolated himself, and he was physically shaking just like you were shaking. And when he would talk, his words were very trembly. And he said the first half of his life, he was together with his wife. His kids were doing good. He was very successful in his job. But it was after the accident, after he went blind, that things started to change. And he ended up getting a divorce from his wife, and his relationship with his kids were affected. And he kind of chuckled, and he said, and Frank said, it's interesting that the last thing he would say was very quickly, I'm with Dad, bye, because he was always jealous of the relationship that me and my father had. And I said, oh, is your father passed away? And he said, yes, my father is passed away. And the fact that he said, I'm with Dad, bye, at the very end was just like that one little last punch, he said, to get back at me that now he is with Dad, when he was always kind of jealous of the relationship that me and Dad had. Frank also explained to me that the way that I described him dying was also very significant, because his brother died in a house fire. So I guess he was smoking a cigarette. The cigarette fell, lit the house on fire, and because he had Parkinson's disease, he couldn't get out of the fire. He said when the autopsy came back, the autopsy showed that he had a heart attack before the fire happened. So he actually died of a heart attack, he didn't die in the fire. He said, to this day, my brother died over, I think it was 20 years ago, he said. My mom still believes that he died in the fire, and that when the autopsy came back, they just told her that he died of a heart attack so that she would feel better and she wouldn't think that her son was stuck in a house fire and couldn't move. And I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So him dying in his sleep, or me feeling like all of a sudden I'm just gone, really shows that the autopsy was correct, and that he did die before the fire happened, and he didn't even know about the fire. So your mom can kind of rest easy knowing that she wasn't lied to. And we are all sitting at the table, and we're dumbfounded. I'm dumbfounded. I have 4 people deer in the headlights staring at me, being like, what just happened? And I said, I have no idea. That has never happened to me before. But as soon as I burped when Frank's brother left, I immediately stopped shaking. I immediately stopped, like my eyes could open. I felt back to myself immediately. And no one had words. It was kind of silent. And it was just like, wow, was the reaction. So as you can imagine, this was a very emotional experience. Tara's mom just got to talk to her father. Tara got to hear a little bit about her grandfather, who she never met. Tara's mom's husband, Frank, he got to connect with his brother. It was just a very overwhelming experience. Emily was sitting there during the whole thing, being like, I've never experienced anything like this. She was kind of like, I didn't really know what I thought about this, but she said, seeing you and how you are physically reacting to this, she's like, I just immediately believe it. She's like, I have to. How could I sit at this table and not believe you? And I had told my friend Tara about the different stories, and she got to witness the cottage story, but she said this was different. This was a whole nother level. She's like, there's no way you could have known any of those details about my mom's life. She said, I didn't even know some of those details about my mom's life. And she's like, I didn't know anything about Frank's brother. She's like, and Frank has been in my life for years, but now I know things that I never even knew before. So at the very end, after lots of hugs and emotional talking to each other, some good conversations, Frank gave me a hug. And I should note that this was the first night that I met Frank. So when I had been to Tara's house very many times, but Frank and Tara's mom travel very often. So this was the first time I had met him. So before we had started working, he had come to the kitchen once, and I kind of shook his hand and I said, hi, I'm Steph. He said, hi, nice to meet you. But he went back down to his office. So I'm hugging this man that I just met, and he said, that was incredible. Thank you so much for that gift. He said, I don't know how that just happened. I don't understand it, but thank you so much for that gift. And he said, I'm so sorry I didn't think of my brother sooner. He said, I was really hoping to talk to my son. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, I can't choose who comes through, but I'm happy that we realized that it was your brother and he was able to give you some of those messages. Now, that one sentence is going to be a very important sentence in just a few weeks. I'm sorry I didn't think of my brother. I was hoping it was my son. That's all that Frank said, but in a few more episodes, that's going to be a very big portion of what happens next. So I'm going to end this episode here. We did take a little break. We got back to work, and we ended up having a very successful event the next day. At the event the next day, Tara's mom was there, and she was telling her brothers these messages. And I kind of felt like I needed to tell her brothers the message as well, because I didn't know which brother was the one that kind of needed that little stern talking to from dad. But as she was explaining, this is Stephanie, and this is what she did for me yesterday, and this is the messages she said, and dad said this, and dad said this. I was kind of like, yeah, and one of you two isn't pulling your weight and agreeing with the other two, so, pick it up. And they laughed, and they also, they believed it, but they didn't believe it. And how can you really? Like, if it didn't happen directly to you, I don't expect anyone to believe me. But it was just really nice to see the difference that this made in Tara's mom's life and in Frank's life. And I found out later that Tara's mom had been trying to connect with her dad for the past 15, 20 years. She had tried everything. She's gone to psychics and card readers. And the closest she ever got was about a month before this, she went to a card reader, and the card reader said something like, your dad is with you. Very simple kind of thing. And she was just looking and longing for more. So she was just like, this is incredible that you were able to give me this gift. I lost my dad when I was 7. And now I just feel like he's with me. And I'm like, of course he's with you. He's always with you. He's with you when you're with your family. He's with your mom when he needs her most. Like, their spirits are always with us. Another really important thing is that they're still witnessing your life. Even though if they're not here in the physical world, the fact that her dad could go over so many big milestones that happened since he passed away is just amazing, that to show that he is still there. Even though he never got to meet your children, he knows you have children. Even though he didn't get to see his son graduate, he knows his son graduated. Even though he never got to meet his grandchildren, he knows he has grandchildren. Like, that's just incredible. And for her mom to know that, it was just so heartwarming for her. So that's where I'm going to end this episode. Episode 4 was a big one, and this day was a big one. Especially the reactions from Tara and her mom, and from Frank, and from Emily, who I also just met that night. This night's energy rippled on for many more weeks to come up until I left. And I'm going to talk about that further in future episodes, about kind of what happens next, and especially what happens next with Frank's son, who he was hoping to connect with. So in the next episode, I'm going to kind of pause where we are right now and answer all those little questions that I'm sure you have. How did you start to know? How does it happen? How does it work? What happened when you told your family? How do your friends react? So if you have any questions that you are interested in knowing up until this point, please send me a message on Instagram, or I have an email on Instagram as well, and let me know, because next week I will cover all those questions. Because after that, I'm going to take you back to before episode 1 and discuss all the little things that were happening before the first big incident, so that we have a very clear understanding of where I am in this moment. So again, thank you for listening to Medium in the Middle. I really appreciate all of the feedback and support that I received this far. Every message has meant so much to me, so thank you all very much. And if you do feel inclined, please subscribe to stay connected with my story, and give us a rating and a comment. All right, guys, see you next week.